Alright, good morning ladies. We are going to actually begin Unit 10 today with a screencast. And per my email, I do want you to read over the document that I have uploaded to Moodle underneath the Unit 10 section that's entitled Vietnam War Intro. And then once you read over that document, you can go ahead and begin the screencast. So now that you've read over the kind of what you need to know first document, you have a general background understanding of what the Vietnam War was even about, and we've already kind of touched base with the fact that it's kind of part of the U.S.'s Cold War containment policy, trying to not allow communism to spread. But we're going to start going into a little more detail with the background now, and we're going to start with French colonialism. So the French had been colonizing and had a presence in Vietnam since the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, right at the turn of the century. And the longer the French were present in Vietnam, the stronger the opposition to them grew. They were not very kind to the Vietnamese people. Now, France will lose its colony during World War II, because you remember that Japan was actually very aggressive in Asia during World War II, and they were going around different parts of the Pacific and taking control of European colonies and not really setting some of these Asian countries free, but taking control for themselves. And so Japan does occupy Vietnam during World War II, but when they lose the war, they're forced to leave and give it up. And the French will be determined to regain control of Vietnam after World War II. So they had it before, they lost it during the war, and now they want it back. Now, the U.S. will support the French, starting in the 1950s. Basically, a communist resistance starts to rise up in North Vietnam in opposition to any sort of French presence coming back. Because remember, the Vietnamese are not really being treated kindly by the French, and so it's natural that a resistance would develop to wanting to kick the French out of their country. But the resistance that develops is a communist one in the north, and that is where we get concerned, because even though we maybe not fully support what France is doing in Southeast Asia, we do not want another Asian country falling to communism. So we begin to actually support the French presence in Vietnam, and we begin sending aid to the French so that they would be able to put down any sort of North communist rebellion to French control. And we do this as part of what we call domino theory. Okay, and I want you to write that term down. We've introduced before containment as one of President Harry Truman's policies during kind of the Cold War era, keeping communism contained. Kind of coinciding with that, when Eisenhower is president, he has this strong belief in what's known as domino theory. And if you think about how dominoes work, when one domino is kind of knocked down, the rest follow. And so, we see what's happened in the Soviet Union, we see what's happening kind of in China, what we fought in Korea, and what Eisenhower truly believes is that if one country falls to communism, they all start beginning to fall to communism. And so he basically thinks even a country as small as Vietnam, because Vietnam doesn't really have a whole lot of global influence at this time in history, and it's a pretty small nation if you look on the map, like I told you to in the What You Need to Know First document. There's not, it's not a very strong, powerful country, but it's the principle of if we start allowing these smaller countries to fall, then maybe all of Asia will turn communist, and that is something that we cannot allow. And so we begin kind of just sending aid, not men, not soldiers just yet. We were sending aid to help the French. But in the end, the French are only able to regain control of the south part of Vietnam. The north part of Vietnam is able to kind of resist French control, and it falls under communist control. And so at an event called the Geneva Conference, which was kind of designed to follow the aftermath of the Korean War, you don't have to know that, but in the aftermath of the Korean War, it also wanted to kind of deal with some of these issues happening around Asia and kind of put an rest to some of these conflicts. And so some diplomatic decisions were made in a set of documents called the Geneva Accords. And per the Geneva Accords, Vietnam would actually be split in half at the 17th parallel. And you do need to know that number, the 17th. North of the 17th parallel would go and fall to communist control. So the Vietnamese communist regime that kind of was gaining power in the north, they get to be in charge of the north for now. And then the French will get control of South Vietnam, south of the 17th parallel. So you have two different Vietnams at this point. You have a North Vietnam that's communist and a South Vietnam that's being colonized and controlled still by the French. Two totally different governments, two different systems in place, because the French aren't communists. And the plan was that by the year 1956, they would have an overall vote across the country on which system the country wanted to adopt. Like, did they want to be democratic or did they want to be communist? And they would take a vote on it, and that's what would decide the entire country's type of government. So that's what was supposed to happen. And so the two leaders' names, and I have them on the slide for you to be able to write them down, of who would kind of be in control as the Vietnamese leader, because obviously the French are kind of controlling the South, but you'll see that there's still going to be a Vietnamese person kind of put in place. But the northern communist Vietnam would fall to Ho Chi Minh's control. Three names: Ho Chi Minh. And then South Vietnam would have the leader named Ngo Dinh Diem. And I think that hopefully that doesn't get cut off on y'all's slide. If it does, it's NGO space DINH space DIEM. And we're just going to know him as Diem. So over these next few years, Vietnam, North Vietnam and South Vietnam are going to come to look like very different places. Ho Chi Minh was a long-time communist. At first, he kind of presents it that he wants to ease North Vietnam into socialism before bringing on full-on communism. But he turns out to be very, very controlling. He pretty much does not allow any sort of free thought. He doesn't really want free-thinking citizens. He doesn't want anyone to oppose him or what the communist regime believes in. So he kind of took control of the education system in North Vietnam, made sure that the textbooks were producing the information that he wanted produced, made sure teachers weren't anti-socialist. He arrested people who spoke out against him. He would even go as far as to kill some who spoke out or disagreed with him publicly. And, he is going to spend a large amount of money, a large amount of his government's budget on building up a military, which does look a little suspicious. And we call the North Vietnamese military essentially the North Vietnamese Army, so we're going to abbreviate it as the NVA. And so he builds up the NVA to be quite extensive, and he does get quite a lot of aid also from both the Soviet Union and China. And those two countries had already gone communist by this point. They're a little bit larger than Vietnam, especially only half the country, North Vietnam. So he is getting aid to kind of build up this military. So already it's kind of looking like you see where this is going. He's not necessarily going to be content with only holding control over the North, and he might be plotting to take the whole country in the future. In the meantime, Diem is in control of the south, the southern portion of Vietnam. And one thing that's interesting is just the if you kind of look at the screen, the two different styles of the men and their appearance. So this is Ho Chi Minh, and then I switch now to Ngo Diem, and he looks westernized. He's in this suit and tie. That's something to consider because he is kind of a westernized individual. He's been heavily influenced, heavily kind of morphed by French culture. Honestly, South Vietnam is in a lot of political and economic chaos once the country split. Diem is not really fit to be the leader of the country. He has a brother who is a political advisor kind of high up the food chain. He kind of is the one who thrusts his brother into this position, as Diem kind of came from like a high social family, but they were kind of the minority because they got along with the French and kind of accepted the French presence in South Vietnam and welcomed the French presence in South Vietnam. And that's not the majority opinion. Most Vietnamese did not want the French to be there. But honestly, because Diem's family was supportive is probably the main reason why he's put into power as well. But like I said, most people aren't really on board with the French presence, and so most people directly oppose Diem's leadership position as prime minister. He's really not experienced at all. He doesn't really know what he's doing. Us and the French will actually come to not like him because he's a weak leader. But in the country itself, the people of Vietnam don't really like him. He's a Catholic, and the majority of the Vietnamese population were Buddhists, and he persecuted and was very oppressive to Buddhist monks and the Buddhist religion. And so that's very against what the country stands for, and that's against what the majority of the country stands for. So it's very obvious from the get-go that he's not going to be popular in his own sovereign side of Vietnam. These elections that are supposed to take place in the mid-50s, they're not going to happen because we're going to stop them because we and the French are going to realize that Diem would lose. His side would lose because he's such a weak leader, and we don't want it to come to a vote if the vote's going to show favor towards Ho Chi Minh, who's basically brainwashing his people into agreeing with him. And so we're going to kind of push off and delay those elections. Now, that's not going to last for long in terms of just the two sides getting along peacefully, because Ho Chi Minh is going to basically make a move and decide it's time to kind of militarize the South and to try to take the South. Now, he's very interesting because he's not really interesting. I don't mean to say interesting, but he's very kind of smart with how he's going to do this, because he's not just going to straight invade South Vietnam. He's going to call for communist sympathizers in South Vietnam to start rebelling from within. He's going to try to weaken South Vietnam from the inside, and then he'll send his North Vietnamese army in, okay? He will have, like, rebels basically do the dirty work for him. So if you recall the little intro document you read, I said we'd be fighting multiple enemies. And this is because Ho Chi Minh basically authorizes guerrilla forces in the South. Guerrilla is spelled, in this case, not like the animal, Guerrilla. So he calls forces in the South to begin using guerrilla warfare tactics to rebel against the South Vietnamese government. And this kind of rebel group in the South, so again, southern individuals, people who are in the South but who are going to rebel against their own southern government, that group is known as the Viet Cong. And so now South Vietnam does not only have to worry about their enemies in the north in terms of the communist army in the north, but now they have a rebel group in the South, a communist group in the South known as the Viet Cong, who are kind of fighting for Ho Chi Minh's cause. And at this point, a revolution is beginning. I want to talk just a little bit more today, just a little more briefly, about our involvement in the war and how we're going to come to get more involved. And we're going to look at this kind of president by president. So, whenever the revolution begins, whenever the Viet Cong start the fighting in South Vietnam, France kind of looks to us for help, because they obviously, they're still kind of having a colonizing presence in South Vietnam, and they don't want the South Vietnamese to fall to communist control themselves, and they're just not really doing enough to fight them. And so we kind of have a dilemma here. You know, this really isn't our problem. This has nothing to do with us except for containment. At the end of the day, it's not necessarily wanting to help our ally France. It's more about preventing South Vietnam from falling to communism. This happened just like with Korea. We were afraid that North Korea would take over South Korea, so we sent troops into South Korea to protect it. So now we're going to want to do the same thing. But we're not going to send troops first, okay? Eisenhower is the first president to make decisions with this conflict, and he definitely believes in domino theory, but he's going to send military and political advisors, not combat troops. He's going to send advisors, not combat troops. And these advisors are going to help South Vietnam form and kind of regulate their army that's going to combat the Viet Cong. And the South Vietnamese army is known as ARVN, which is ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Now, when we start sending this kind of presence there, it's almost the end of the French involvement in Vietnam. And let me kind of explain that, because that seems kind of backwards. It's like we're showing up to help and all of a sudden France is out. Well, essentially, there's growing tension between Diem and the French, because he kind of starts to favor our involvement and our military uniforms and our military strategy that we're kind of training. And, we think we're just helping the French. We're not trying to kick them out of their position, but essentially it's what we do, okay? Diem wants to rely more on our help, and so the French just say, listen, we just finished World War II, we're not looking to fight this hard anymore, so we're done. So France leaves, and now it's all on us. But this just makes it more interesting for us because, again, if we're the only thing standing between Ho Chi Minh being able to take all of South Vietnam for himself and make it communist, then we don't want to leave. Now, us building Arvin is really a huge headache for us. The soldiers in Arvin are not experienced. They're inefficient. There is a lot of corruption in the army because Diem would choose his friends to be kind of leadership positions in the army and not really those who are highly qualified. And, the biggest issue with Arvin is that we are modeling them after our own army. And our own army is not really trained in guerrilla warfare tactics. I'm going to be honest, we don't know how to fight the Viet Cong, and because we don't know how to fight them, we're not the best people in mind who should be teaching the Arvin how to fight them. One of the major reasons we are going to end up losing this war is we don't help prepare for it correctly. We don't really understand the nature of the war and the style of the fighting. And what I mean by, guerrilla warfare, just so I can define this a little more clearly for y'all, the Viet Cong are not an official army. They're not being trained by a government. They're rebel forces. They are almost like towns, village militia that sneak up in places you don't expect them to be. There's no rules. There's no strategy. Well, there is strategy, but the strategy is you don't need to be as organized as the types of war we're used to fighting with, like trench warfare and, Operation Overlord with, D-Day, massive land invasions. Like, this is more underground tunnels, sneak up when your enemy's not looking, fight them in small groups, and then run away. We just, we're not going to be able to prepare for that style of fighting, especially when it's in a foreign country and we don't know the lay of the land. So unfortunately, at this stage of the war, even though our soldiers aren't there, the soldiers that we are helping to train, we're basically setting them up for failure. And just so you know, during Eisenhower's presidency, we never actually sent troops, like our own troops, to fight directly. It was only trainers at this point. So we will talk about how that changes over the course of the next president's involvement, starting in class on Tuesday. So if y'all have any questions about this, rewatch it, write your questions down. I understand this unit is going to get a little bit confusing as we wind down this year, but we will discuss more in class tomorrow. Hope y'all have a good day.